Sorry. Let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. It is 6:30, August 3rd. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Some quick introductions. Joining me at the table here to my right is Superintendent Matt Degner, Directors Lisa Williams, Janet Godwin, Vice President Ruthina Malone, Director Charlie Eastham, and Recording Secretary Kim Coleman. Let's get right into it. We have one pretty big topic on our agenda tonight, some of our health and safety protocols for the upcoming school year. So I'm going to kick it right over to Matt, and let's just get into it.
All right, thank you, President Eystone. Good evening, everybody. Tonight we want to share with you some of the health and safety mitigation efforts that we're planning for the 21-22 school year. The goal, hopefully, this evening is to have consensus around some of these efforts with the understanding we know that information continues to evolve and change as it has throughout the pandemic, and reserve the right to adjust those when necessary. But some general consensus on these efforts so that we could communicate out to families tomorrow what these would look like, what our best guess and best effort at this point is for our plan moving towards August 23rd, as well as opening up the online enrollment period for our online program through August 9th, and that would give families a few days to process this information and make a decision about what works best for them as a family, and we would open that up through August 9th. But with the lack of vaccines for our youngest students, I think it highlights the importance and the need for us to consider these different measures. Of course, as we approach the school year, and as Chase shares some information here with you tonight around these health and safety mitigation efforts, we've been familiarizing ourselves, of course, with the CDC COVID data tracker and about our potential move from moderate to substantial to high, as you see in different counties in the state and across the country do that. We know that we will strongly be encouraging masks in our school district buildings and schools as the CDC recommends for that. We know that we can't require those, but we know that parents entrust their young ones to us, and when we look at this as a collective responsibility and collective effort, we will be sending that message and encouraging that throughout as well. So the final thing I'd say, I guess, before I turn it over to Chase that way, just a clarification point that I know he'll share again in this information, is that there was some confusion at the end of the year around the executive order surrounding school buses and transportation and what that meant in terms of the law that was passed in prohibiting the requirement of masks in school buildings. We do have clean legal advice from council that we will be on solid ground to require the use of masks on our school buses, and so that we do plan to do that. And so I wanted to share that from the onset as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chase, and he's going to walk you through this guidance document, and then how we've tiered some of this that could include more information as we go out and continue to evolve with the pandemic. So with that, Chase, you can take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening. As Matt said, we'd like to walk through kind of our draft health and safety guidance that we're planning to put in place for this fall. As Matt mentioned, we're working closely with Johnson County. So you'll see there in orange that we have it rated as substantial as the transmission rate. As of today, the transmission rate for the county is moderate, and when we wrote these, we wrote them as we were in a moderate state. However, indications are that that could change to substantial. And so we brought you this document with two-tone color on purpose, so you could see kind of where our baseline was, which is the black. What you'll see in orange are some of the enhanced protocols we will put in place should Johnson County move to substantial. And so kind of as the guide as we look through here, the black is what we had anticipated with the rates being a little bit lower before the CDC guidance came out, but also saying that we were in that moderate level. And so this orange additions will be the enhancement we put on top of our already implemented health and safety protocols as we move forward. And of course, I think the first two things to point out, as Superintendent Degner said, is the district is committed to and encouraging mask wearing per the CDC guidance for all teachers, staff, students, and visitors to schools. We understand that we can't require that by law, but that sits as a second point because we do see the importance of face coverings because, as the CDC has told us, they work. The only thing that we prioritize above that is also vaccinations because, like mask coverings, we know that the vaccine is one of our best mitigating factors against COVID and the spread. And so we want to point off right at the top that two things that we are strongly in support of are all individuals that are eligible to get the vaccine, to get a vaccine, and also to wear face covering per the guidance of the CDC. We'll make those available in all buildings, but as Matt pointed out, per Iowa law, we will not require any individuals to wear face coverings, and will respect that choice of all individuals that come into our buildings. Hand washing and physical distancing, those were two of the other main pieces that we've heard since the beginning of the pandemic that were important to preventing the spread of COVID-19, and so they remain also pieces of our strategy. Of course, physical distancing is limited for us this year as we welcome back the majority of our students onto campus. That limits our abilities to provide 6 to 3 feet of social distancing in every classroom. Given our limitations, the number of classes in the school buildings, we cannot guarantee that. We're going to work with our buildings to maximize social distancing where possible, but we do want to be transparent that given the number of students on campus that we cannot make those guarantees in our classrooms as we move forward this year. Last spring, the district moved to the contact tracing and quarantine guidelines as put out by the Iowa Department of Public Health. At this point, we are recommending that we continue to follow that guidance that the board adopted last spring as we move through the school year. Our understanding is that there could be additional guidance coming out from IDPH this week, and so if that happens, we can provide an update to the board at next week's board meeting or when that happens. So right now, we implemented this guidance and this change to Iowa Department of Public Health in the spring, and we are going to continue that course as we move into the fall. Stay at home at sick, of course. If individuals are sick, whether you're students or staff, we do want you to stay home and follow the guidelines that have been in place about isolating at home for 10 days and then being fever-free before you return. And we can come back to all of these, but there are things that we've talked about, so we'll just go through them and then come back and answer any questions. Classroom capacity, as I just mentioned, with going away from our hybrid schedule and more of our students coming back onto campus, we are going to go back to utilizing our classroom capacity guidelines articulated in board policy, otherwise known as our RAM model. We were able to add some additional staff this year through our ESSER dollars, and so we're going to utilize levels 1 through 4. That will help keep our class sizes somewhat smaller, but again, larger than they have been last year while we were in the hybrid model. Classroom cohorts, so this is one of those examples of things in orange, where if we're into that substantial, where there will be more focus on these classroom cohorts at the elementary level to keep together throughout the instructional day, as well as eating lunch. We are trying to balance the need for instruction for all students, and so we will carve out an exception for ELL, SPED, and Title I academic support services to ensure that while we maintain high levels of health and safety, we also ensure that we're meeting the educational needs of our students in the school environment. Meals, some good news from the federal government that we've shared before. All meals are free this year. However, we know that students will be in our online program, so we will continue to offer our grab-and-go services throughout the school year. We've been looking at the numbers over the summer and from last spring and our utilization rate. It's a bit down, and we don't expect it to climb this fall given how many students will be back in the school building. So we're going to start out with 4 sites this fall: Hills, Southeast, Northwest, and North Central, but we'll continue to monitor those, and if we need to add additional sites, move those sites. Allison's teams have been great about being flexible and responsive to those needs. Our cleaning and disinfecting pieces are very familiar to what we did at the end of the school year. We're going to continue to maintain those as we know that's an important piece of what we do as we move forward. We've heard about air quality and ventilation, FMP 1.0. Dwayne, Jeff, and team, that was one of the pieces that was a priority, upgrading our HVAC systems and our ventilation systems in the school. And so as you see there, we meet all local state building codes, CDC, and the ASHRAE requirements. One of the misconceptions is that we should open the windows to provide better ventilation. Actually, that has a negative effect in our buildings because of our air systems. And so I think it's an important message that it is crucial as we make sure that there's clean air, but that we need to keep our windows actually closed so our systems can work. Field trips and student travel. Over the summer, we had backed off of this restriction because of that moderate or low transmission rate. But given if we go back up to substantial, unfortunately, one of those balance pieces is that we will continue to have to restrict field trips until further notice as we look at health and safety protocols. Matt mentioned transportation. Per the President's executive order, we will require face coverings on all bus and school vehicles. This is not just to and from school, but is related to extra and co-curricular activities as well. A little bit more orange as we look at some of those differences when we're in the different transmission zones. Visitors and volunteers. This one is one that we're not excited about because we understand the important part our community plays inside our school buildings. But as we look at how our hands are tied with mask requirements and ensuring that we try to keep our students that are ineligible for a vaccine at this point as safe as possible, that we limit their potential exposure. And so we will continue to limit visitor and volunteer access in our buildings if the county is in a substantial setting. Large gatherings, we know that we do need to provide those, but we will have limitations. For indoor gatherings, we will limit those to 50% of the room capacity. We have our building access availability for our students and our staff. This is to ensure that we can continue to clean the buildings at a high level while still providing access outside the school day. And then community use. Something that we had, again, began allowing this summer is an element we will put back on hold if we are in a substantial transmission zone, at least for those indoor spaces, until we come back to that moderate or low level. Kristen did a nice job last year of updating our COVID dashboard on a regular basis so we could see the number of individuals that were positive for both students and staff in the district. We will continue to maintain that, provide that transparency and that information to our community on a regular basis, and kind of starting or ending where we started as we look at the level of transmissions. As I mentioned, we are currently looking at this guidance in front of you as if the county is in a substantial transmission rate, and we use the CDC COVID data tracker as our guide for that information, and we'll revisit that regularly. And lastly, we know that this is important information for our families as they make decisions about the learning mode for their children this fall. And as we send out this guidance, hopefully tomorrow, we have this caveat on there for enrollment into the ICCSD pre-K-12 online learning program. That will be something that we'll incorporate not only in this document, but in the message that goes out so families have the information they need around health and safety when they make decisions about learning for their students this school year. I know that was very quick, but wanted to leave time for discussion. So with that, we'll open it for questions and discussion. Matt?
All right, thanks, Chase. Really appreciate it. I'll just throw it out there to directors. I know there's been a lot of communications and stuff, so whatever questions we want to bring up to just have discussion about, I welcome it at this point. Go ahead,
Chase,
Charles.
on the online learning program enrollment, are we going to fill in the dates here, or is that?
We are. We left them blank on purpose just for the discussion this evening so that we didn't not leave ourselves enough room in case we needed to make any adjustments based on guidance we might receive from the board this evening.
The one thing I would impress upon you on behalf of our staff is that we really do need to close that window by August 9th. I know that we have a meeting on the 10th and it would be convenient to come back, but we lose 3 days essentially in that scenario if we wait till, if we punt any decisions and don't close that enrollment period for our online learning program until that 11th time period. That puts us in a really tight turnaround to try to have schedules and teachers assigned and staffing changes that would have to be made in preparation for August 23rd. So while we left that date blank, there is a big force on our end that is driving that conversation that we really need to have that completed by August 9th and have the deadline for any of those enrollment changes happen by then.
So Matt, when you say August 9th, 11:59 p.m. August 9th, or?
Yeah, we would let it roll through
Sure.
that night. That's kind of when we've been doing the cutoff, so we would take it until end of the, last minute, like you said, on the 9th, yeah.
Sean, we had a correspondence from a parent regarding provisions for students in performing arts programs. Can you talk about that a little bit, Chase or Matt? If we're- I say, we had a correspondence from a parent about students who are in performing arts programs and what mitigation measures we're going to utilize for those students.
I think if you just want to talk about extracurriculars in general, that
Yeah,
came
that'd
in
be-
late
yeah.
around music
Yeah.
in particular, but yeah.
Our approach this year is that these mitigation strategies would apply to all of our programs, instructional programs, co-curricular, extracurricular, performing arts, athletics. We didn't go through and create the 30-plus page document like we did last year. And so it would be, as it says at the top of the document, we are going to have all of our standard processes, procedures, and policies in place, and then these would lay on top of those. And so the mitigation strategies for performing arts would be the same as you would do in our classroom spaces or other, as Matt mentioned, extracurricular or athletic activities.
And we're going to be able to provide personal protective equipment for students that are in various performance.
We're going to have face coverings available, hand sanitizer, the PPE that we had available in our buildings last year will continue to be available to individuals this year.
So I'll jump in. I want to say first, thank you to the team. I know that you all have been working really hard on figuring out what school's going to look like on August 23rd. And we are certainly in a spot, I think, that none of us wanted to be in. I think in May, we were all really optimistic that we'd be off on a better foot to start school, and that there would be a vaccine for our smallest kids available in September or October. And I don't think we knew what Delta variant meant back in May. So it certainly is disappointing to find ourselves in this situation. I have to just add my perspective, and one that I think that we've been hearing a lot from the community. And I want to preface this, I'm less concerned with our secondary buildings. Those students have access to the vaccine. Some of them are 18, some of them are adults and can make a choice whether or not to wear a face covering and really drive their decisions forward on their own. I'm more concerned about our elementary buildings because our kids in elementary don't have access to the vaccine. And as the only board member at the table tonight with 2 young kids who are in an elementary school, I just have to say I identify very strongly with the feedback that we've been getting from our elementary parents about the concern about sending their kids back to school. And it's 2-part. It's parents who had their kids on online last year, who pulled them out and did that. And I was a parent that did that for 2 trimesters. And I just really empathize with how badly they want their kids back at school. I mean, our online program was great. And I can say that because I participated in it, but it is not a substitute for in-person education, especially for our elementary kids. And so we have parents that are desperate to get their kids back in school, but they are going to be disappointed with these mitigation efforts because they're going to be concerned that they don't go far enough. They know that we cannot require masks. We all know that. But I think what I'm most disappointed about or would like to discuss more is our quarantine policy and whether or not we can have some thought behind some tweaks to that and making it so that if you are wearing a face covering at school and there is a COVID positive in your classroom, you don't need to quarantine. But if your child comes to school and makes the choice to not wear a mask and they're exposed to a COVID positive child in that classroom, they're going to have to go home and quarantine. And I don't think that we should provide instructional support during that time. I'm not saying we ramp up some sort of online school to give kids in quarantine. That's impossible to do. I understand that. But if parents want to make the choice to send their kids to school without a mask, then they are going to risk going into quarantine without instructional support for 2 weeks. And those kids that do come to school and wear masks, they don't have to go through the quarantine process. I think that one tweak is going to provide a lot of reassurance to parents that their classrooms are safe, and I think it's going to encourage mask wearing with our youngest and unvaccinated students. I read an article that this Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox. And that is that is terrifying to think of sending your kindergartner into a room where there might be something as contagious as chickenpox, but much more serious. And I know that the answer is go to online school. I don't think that's a fair answer. A lot of these parents have done online school for the past year, and it is tough. And these kids want to be back in person. And so I empathize with that point of view, and I think, I really think it's a credible question of why can't we tweak that quarantine just a little bit?
I'll just add to that before anybody tries to answer, because the one note that I wrote down was in the spring, we did go through that discussion of switching from CDC guidance to the IDPH guidance to help reduce the amount of quarantines, but not at the sake of the health and safety of our kids. Because at the time, IDPH was you don't have to quarantine if you have a mask on. I believe it has since changed to just don't quarantine at all, right? And so that's a big difference, right? So the decision we made was based on different, different situations. So I think it's definitely worth talking about that point. I do feel that unvaccinated, unmasked people, let alone kids, they're at the greatest risk of getting it and passing it on. So that's my biggest concern about all this as well, quite honestly.
Sure, I think that's just to interject here a little bit and then hear from Samoria. I think that's a very fair question and one that we've discussed a lot. I think part of our challenge right now is what guidance could we point to that we would follow? Iowa Department of Public Health doesn't recommend quarantining at all. They sent a letter on May 14th to schools saying that quarantining shouldn't happen. That was about at the same time as the mask deal the last 2 weeks of school, for us the last 4 weeks. And the CDC guidance, we really wouldn't be able to follow because it is contingent upon mask wearing, right? And that's something we know we don't have as a tool. And so I think that's our struggle. So then would we be making up our own essentially quarantine guidance that we would adopt and follow? But for us, we've always tried to stay consistent to say, what is the public health organization we're going to point to that this is what we're following? So in some way, it would, I know hybrid became a dirty word to some people, but it would be that we would have to do a hybrid of some kind of guidance because we wouldn't have an institution really to point to that we could follow to the letter of the law. And so I don't know if any team members would have anything they'd want to add to that, but that was part of our challenge in presenting a recommendation to you tonight about, okay, well, where would we find ourselves and in which guidance could we really follow because of the problem I outlined there.
Do we know, when Johnson County Public Health came and talked to us, I asked them why. Do we know why or what study IDPH based their decision to change their quarantine policy on? Did they have data or information, or did they just change it? Because if they just changed it, then I feel less tied to follow. If there's no scientific reason to change it, I feel less tied to following the IDPH guidance. But if there was some good reason, I'm happy to hear what that rationale was.
I'm not sure there was compelling data presented to us in that letter to the field. It was basically a letter to the field, and like I said, it was coupled with the change in the mask legislation there at the end of the session, that was delivered to school districts. So,
and you said that guidance came in May.
May 14th, yeah, and they haven't adjusted, since then. I do think part of our other thing, and I outlined the problem to you with the date for us need to close the online programming piece, and I think this is why it's all coupled together, that I think we do expect to hear something from Iowa Department of Public Health in the next week or so, but we don't know what that is. Will it be to the point where we're not allowed to even quarantine students, and do they have the authority to do that? Is it going to be something softer that they just don't recommend we do that? but I think there is a question mark in the air about what will still come from the state health department in that effort.
So, Matt, can we get any guidance or from the district's health and safety committee on this?
Sure, I'll let Chase kind of talk through what the health and safety team's been up to in some of our conversations with local health officials. Charlie, good question.
So we did, and I apologize, I should have said, that we did bring health and safety committee together yesterday to get their feedback on the guidance that we were putting out, and they understood the predicament that we're in, but they, as with the state law and kind of the uphill battle that we're facing, they gave us some good feedback on trying to do what we're doing, understanding those limitations that we have. We also talked with Johnson County Public Health today, and they've kind of asked the same questions about, they don't know exactly where Iowa Public Health is or what they're coming out with in terms of the quarantine protocols, Charlie. And so Health and Safety had basically the same conversation that we're having, and the conversation we had with Johnson County Public Health was somewhat similar as well. You can go to the CDC guidance, but here's what it is, here's where you get hung up because of what you have to do because we're in Iowa, but then also from the Iowa Department of Public Health, they're saying, they're not really having you quarantine. And so it was, and Kate and Jess, please add if you want to, the conversation was good with health and safety. We feel it's important to talk to our community partners, to give that feedback, to have experts in the field weigh in on what we're doing. So the reassuring part was understanding the circumstances that we face and all schools face, that we're headed in the right direction, but also acknowledging there are limitations. There are limitations given to what we can do from a health and safety perspective, and also a little bit of that unknown as we go to school of where that quarantine guidance is.
I think part of what we might suggest to you this evening that wasn't on the actual sheet, but that as we considered this move from potential moderate to substantial to high, would be considering a similar philosophy around when or how we decide to quarantine. So when we move into the high, would we then implement a more restrictive quarantine practice where it's not a voluntary quarantine practice, and we would reserve that to that if we moved into the high transmission rate, then we would go back to a more restrictive quarantine piece to try to slow the spread at that point. But if we're existing in this moderate or substantial range, would we stay with you're notified as a close contact, parents make the decision that's best for them, but when we move into the high category, would we do something different then? And again, we could look at that by level, but that's a piece that's evolving for us. And I do think from talking to Johnson County Public Health today and some officials from the University of Iowa, they seem like that would be a reasonable approach for us to take and would support us looking at it in that direction too. We just don't have a lot of tools to employ. I know it's frustrating, and Lisa was sharing her experience as a mom. I mean, different ones of us are parents and are in the same situation, right? I have a fourth grader too that is going to attend school, and we're concerned. We did online last year, so we definitely empathize with that, and we get that. And I think we are trying to take a measured approach about when do we deploy the tools we have, while also not creating another problem where keeping kids out of school for a long period of time that we know we experienced in the spring. And there was mass frustration with that as well that we heard from the community, where repeated quarantines for students and then the lack of learning opportunities at home and who that impacts on a different level from an equity lens. So I think those are all legitimate concerns for us, but I think the best place we could potentially land in this or recommend to you tonight would be, if we want to look at something more restrictive with quarantine, would it make more sense to wait until we reach that high transmission rate, and then we could reevaluate, or we could set a time period. We've done that through this experience too. When we did back off our quarantine, let's take the first 2 weeks of school, the first 3 weeks of school, and monitor how it's going, and then revisit that. None of these things we have to shut the door on. So that would be the other thing to throw out there for thinking.
I do think, I like us being flexible and adaptable with our quarantine policy, but that makes the choice for parents sending their kids back tough. Because there's more of that unknown. And I do think we have to be flexible. And I do think that if the vaccine is available for children and they can be fully vaccinated by February or so, I think that's going to require a substantial revision to our health and safety guidelines once everyone has the opportunity to get fully vaccinated. But I agree that I don't want a quarantine policy that keeps kids out of class. Absolutely agree. But the best way that a kid can guarantee that they're going to school is if they just put a mask on. And then they go, and then they're not subject to quarantine. I mean, that's something that 99.9% of our families, I think, can do. There may be a few exceptions for medical issues here and there. But that's how you keep your kid out of quarantine. And speaking of the equities and who this impacts, you know, it's funny, we've predominantly heard from women on our email. And that's because those moms know that they're the ones that are gonna be bearing the brunt of, if their child gets sick and has COVID and has to stay home, they're gonna have to take time out of the workforce. I was on a Zoom today, and I can't remember the stat that was out there, but it's the majority of people who have not re-entered the workforce in Iowa are women between the ages of 40 and 55. And I don't think that's a surprise, because that's the age group with still young kids. I'm in that age group. I've got a first grader and a third grader at home. And it's because of the ramifications of childcare responsibilities that result from COVID. And if you can avoid those and all of those concerns and know that you can go to work because you're sending your kid to school in a mask, I just think that's going to give parents so much more reassurance that school is safe and that we care about the safety of the kids and that we want them in our buildings.
I would just walk us back to last spring, right? We were understandingly getting communication from parents upset about their kid quarantining for the third, fourth, fifth time, right? Like, that was really tough for folks. And what made a huge difference is when we did change that requirement that if they were then wearing masks, they weren't quarantining. And that worked well, and folks were happy with that, right? So we have experience that that is a rule that works for us. I understand that things have changed a little bit in, you know, what the guidance is and everything, but guidance is guidance. And I think if our job is to make sure that we're providing a safe environment for our kids, I think we can go a little bit stronger. I don't know that I want to use guidance from May. As Lisa aptly said, nobody had heard of anything called a Delta variant at that point. Things have changed. So, I mean, that's a rule that has worked for us. If you have a mask on, you're not quarantining, and that worked for the vast majority of the people. We're still not mandating masks anywhere, right? That is still the choice. That's what people are asking for, but choices have consequences, and I think we owe it to all of the other students to make sure we're doing what we can to keep them safe. And I saw some heads nodding with the idea of, you know, as we move between the moderate and high and things like that, you know, we can be flexible that way. I will say that, you know, maybe I'll be a little counter to that, and that if you've waited till you're high, perhaps it's too late. So, you know, that scares me if that many people are already being positive and potentially being hospitalized, you know, that may be too late to step in and do something. So that's my take on that. But I really think that of all of the things we can do is just saying, you know, if you're masked, you know, that's going to help us not transmit a virus. So do that and you won't have to quarantine. That's all I got.
Where I'm agreeing with what folks are saying generally. Where I'm getting a little bit hung up is we're talking about elementary students, and the variability of what happens in a classroom. And so in theory, it all sounds really easy to implement. Like, you know, kids wearing a mask, or they're not wearing a mask, they have to quarantine. I just feel like in a classroom, it's going to be a bit more variable. There's going to be other things at play. Peer pressure, you know, parents wanting their kids to do one thing, wear a mask or not wear a mask. I just, I'm struggling a little bit with having such a clear-cut sort of delineation around who quarantines and who doesn't, just recognizing that on the face of it, it sounds really easy to implement. I feel like it's going to be harder in the actual classroom to make it happen. With a degree of fidelity and fairness, I think that we'd end up, I just think we're going to end up in some tricky situations if we have that policy.
I think that's a good point. I'll share my anecdotal data that my kindergartner, before the law changed and the masks were required, everyone wore a mask. And it wasn't a problem. And, you know, these are 6-year-olds, and they all get that. And so the kids can do it. And so then it's the logistic stuff, right, that you're bringing up.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit worried about peer pressure. I don't know how that's going to play out in a classroom of, I just, we're asking, little kiddos to make some of these choices. And I know our teachers are going to be really helpful and supportive and helping kids make the right choices, but it's encouraged, it's not required. I just feel like we're sort of walking some lines here. We need to be very careful.
No,
Sorry.
I don't think we're going to avoid the peer pressure by not, I think the peer pressure is going to be present no matter what we do. I mean, it was present for the last 2 weeks of school. And so I guess that's going to happen, no matter what the 6 of us decide. Even if we stick with this quarantine, there are going to be kids going to school in masks, and there are going to be kids not in masks, and there are going to be peer pressure. If there's a quarantine policy that we tweak a little bit, that peer pressure is still going to exist. I don't think we can do anything to prevent that,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
The other piece I was going to share, and I'm just probably going to reiterate this before I share it, because I don't want to come off as that in some way I'm opposed to masks. I mean, if we could require masks, we would do it, right? I mean, I think that's what we do. That would be our recommendation to you. So it's not to do with that. I think Janet's on to something from the standpoint that our staff is going to be put in a really difficult situation in this scenario too. So if they're having to work with the nurses to contact trace, and then they're reporting that the student didn't have their mask up or was down for part of the day, and the parent then has asked our teacher to make sure that student has their mask on, I think that puts them in a difficult legal position, because they're being told they shouldn't enforce a mask mandate. But if a parent is questioning the teacher and saying, why aren't you telling them to keep their mask up? I think we would hear some of those concerns if Brady were here tonight, but I'm not going to interject and speak for him. But I do think the employer side of us also has to think about the side that we're putting our staff into, and is that a fair position to put them in? Because I do think there'll be some pressure that come from that. I mean, parents will want their kids to keep their masks up, as they should, right? Because they don't want them quarantined. And then who's that responsibility going to fall on, especially for our younger learners? It's going to be our staff that we put in this situation to make sure kids are doing that. And then do they even have the ability to do that? Are they on firm ground to be doing that?
I wanted to clarify that, like Lisa, I was thinking primarily at the elementary level. I don't know if we have to make the assumption that, the 12 and ups are vaccinated if they, want to be, right? So as a straight rule, if you're not wearing a mask, you're quarantined. I don't know that carries through into secondary. So I want to be clear there. But I do think to that point, Matt, you're right in that we can't, in the moment, if somebody's got it down below their nose or whatever, we can't just you're not wearing it right, put it on right, that stuff. But I do think that it would be fairly quick to get to know these 10 kids over here are coming in wearing a mask every day, and these 10 kids over here are never wearing a mask, right? To aid in that contact tracing in that way. Will one kid not have their mask on at the exact right time that they're potentially exposed to someone? That may happen. And that may have happened when we had, a mask mandate, right? And even after we changed our quarantine rules there. So that was happening. So I think we can at least have an idea of who's intending to be wearing it and who's not. I know that's not foolproof, but.
No, I understand. My job is just to point out to all the things we've had in terms of conversation, right? And all the challenges behind it, so that we don't have any blind spots before we make a decision to do something. Because I would agree with Janet, I think it seems easy on the surface, but it's a lot more difficult in implementation, and then consistent implementation across several buildings and several classrooms with students. And like I said, I mean, I think where our position would be if we were able to be. That's not where we're at. We don't have vaccines for our youngest ones yet, so we're just trying to think of what are the best things we can do to implement at this point. The other, and I've already pointed this out once, I think the other one is then we just be adopting our own quarantine protocols, basically, right? Because we're not doing CDC, we're not doing Iowa Department of Public Health. We'd really be going it alone, and that may be something you're comfortable with, but I just think that's an awareness thing we should have out there, that we're not really going off the guidance of one institution at that point.
But couldn't very well, from what I'm hearing, there's going to be a press conference Thursday. And based on conversations other school districts are having, what I don't want to have happen, we lock ourselves into something and then it's a scramble for our team come Tuesday. Knowing where we're standing on, I'm fine with mask, no mask, you have to quarantine, but I don't know if we need to spend all that time. I mean, having that discussion tonight is great, but we've seen it happen quite a few times last year. A decision is made, we spend very thoughtful time over that decision, and it appears as though someone watches our meetings, and then different guidelines come out at a press conference on Thursday. I don't want the message, I know how stressful that is on parents when they're like, oh, great, why didn't they just wait till Thursday? They knew that this was happening. We have a meeting on Tuesday. I think it's great to have this discussion tonight, but I'm not certain we have to lock ourselves in knowing something, and it's just gonna upset everybody. That's just my, devil's advocate moment tonight.
No, you're right. Of course, you're right. I mean, the problem is we're going to close online registration on August 9th. And so, and that's the impossible choice for the parents.
Right, we can't, and that's an unfortunate, impossible choice. I don't think regardless of what we said tonight, that would change that. That's the only thing I'm saying, that we have seen it happen. And I don't want to give parents false hope by us saying something tonight, and then they're like, oh, well, Iowa City's going to do this. Something happens on Thursday, and then the 9th comes around, our meeting is Tuesday. We can't communicate, that turnaround won't happen. So for me, I would want parents to know that that's our stance, that's what we would like to see happen, but we can't make that final decision until Tuesday. Because I don't want to give parents that false sense of, oh, Iowa City is going to fight like heck against whatever comes out. And just go against all the rules.
I hope they know we tried that last year.
No,
and we lost.
there are parents that know we tried that, but there's also some parents that, have great faith that we have these suits of armors and we're gonna fight like heck to do, and we want to fight like heck to do what we can to keep their kids safe. I get that. But at the same time, I think we have to be realistic for our families, knowing that this is a tough choice, so they can understand that our hands are really tied. We got so many emails, just require a mask. We cannot do that. So that's all I'm saying. I think we need to continue with that conversation, but the message tonight is there's very limited options that we can provide for children under 12 coming into our building, besides opening online enrollment.
And I think we detailed out the other things we can do, but you're right, Ruthina. I think some of those options are limited. I do think the other awareness thing is the legislature will reconvene in the fall, and they will probably look at things like vaccine mandates. They'll probably look at quarantines, and so like you said, I don't think it puts us in a good scenario to set people up to think that this is the way it's going to be and this is going to change. We've lived through that too many times with our experience in that way, and so that's where I go back to our best foot forward at this point may be to say, do we take a 2-week time period at the start of the year, monitor what our case counts look like? If it's concerning, we can, at that point, we may know more about what Iowa Department of Public Health has said around quarantines. We could implement a more rigorous quarantine protocol at that point if we've had it. I get Sean's concern about it is waiting to see if it gets worse before you do something rather than starting to keep it down. And that's been our tricky thing since the beginning of this, that if what we do works, the evidence isn't necessarily there because people aren't getting infected and getting sick. If what you do doesn't work, then the evidence is pretty clear in front of you, right? Because people are transmitting the virus. But we could either do that or we could just make a commitment to saying we are going to ramp up to some more aggressive quarantine protocols if we hit the red or if we hit the high. And then, we could bring that back by next week about exactly what those would be. If that's a more comfortable position for people to be in and clearly state what that would be and try to link it into some of the guidance I already articulated a couple times, the challenge with what guidance we could follow, but we could work with Johnson County Public Health on that some more.
Yeah, I mean, for me tonight, the big clarifications are opening of online learning enrollment through the 9th. That's big, and we've had a lot of feedback and concerns about that. And so I think that's a great piece of concrete information that we can share coming out of this meeting tonight. And number 2 is the transportation question. The masks on transportation is another clear piece of guidance and work that we can communicate very clearly to parents so they understand sort of what the baseline is there. I also do like the way this plan, set of protocols has been tiered based on the risk level. And so I think you've done some nice thinking around how we would elevate or add more constraints in should the level of positivity go up. So I mean, I think we've gone as far as we can, to me, is what it feels like based on what we know today. But we are providing 2 new pieces of concrete information to parents that will be responsive to the questions that we've received, and is helpful.
Well, I think the discussion, about, to me, comes down to we really need to do everything we can to encourage elementary students, especially to wear a mask when they're in the buildings, when they're in their classroom. I have some confidence that the teachers in buildings and principals will support students who want to do that, who want to wear a mask. And I think there was a recommendations from the, what was it? The DPO group, the DPO group that we support teachers, and actually they recommend counselors that undertake that task. To me, teachers are actually probably better positioned to do that, especially at the elementary level. I don't want to put teachers in the position of contradicting what parents are telling their students. We don't want to do that. But, I think they will be able to communicate to their students what's going on, why some students are wearing masks, why it's important, and what the effect is. So we may have there may be more mask wearing as school starts, than it might look like at the beginning. I'm struggling a bit with the notion of using quarantine measures as a way of supporting higher mask compliance or higher mask wearing. I just haven't been able to think that through about what the ramifications are for all students for that kind of an approach. But I agree with Janet that there are definitely two things that are coming out of this meeting that are helping students to be safe in the building. So
I want to add that one of the reasons I brought this up is not, the secondary effect is it may encourage mask wearing, but I think the science is clear. Masks are effective in protecting you and protecting unvaccinated and vaccinated people from catching COVID. And if we have a room full of unvaccinated kids and they're exposed to COVID, I think the science is pretty solid that if you have a mask on, you have a great chance of not catching COVID. While the converse is true, if you don't have a mask on and you're exposed in an elementary classroom for 6 hours during that day, you're probably going to get COVID. So a lot of that for me is just back to basic science about what we know about this disease. And that then if you have another kid who has an exposure, doesn't have a mask on, high risk of contracting COVID, where are they going to go and spread it, if they don't quarantine? And so I think the secondary benefit is it's going to encourage mask wearing, but the primary benefit is to me, it's going to keep spread down in our schools, is that type of quarantine policy.
yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I was kind of looking at it the same way it was, as the carrot or stick, and I kind of think it's both, right? I mean, it is punitive in a way, but at the same time, it's how you help prevent the spread of disease. So I can kind of see it both ways. I guess to Director Malone's point of there being potential new guidance between now and next Tuesday, I guess what I would like, and you can, it's just me saying this, not as a whole board, right? I mean, I think we've got our little orange parts throughout this document of what we would do if it ramps up. I guess to start with, I would like to see, what that looks like in the quarantine section as we talked about. And then we can talk about it again on Tuesday, post whatever other guidance we have. I do think that's the biggest sticking point of this whole thing. I mean, I feel firmly confident that we will do a great job, cleaning in the buildings and, spacing as best we can. I think teachers will, if the opportunity arises, we'll take kids outside for class. I mean, we'll do all sorts of things, but I think the quarantine piece is, I think it's important to get our heads around it because, this isn't like new. We've been doing this for a year and a half now, and a bunch of people that are not doing the mitigation steps that are provided, like masks and vaccinations, are more likely to transmit disease. I mean, that's pretty simple in my head. So I think that's the piece we really need to make sure we're doing it right. And waiting until we have different new guidance may be the right thing to do. But I don't think we can, I don't think just saying we can't go out on our own is an answer, because I think we can go out on our own, but I think it may be important to figure out if we are going out on our own or not before I make that decision. So I'm fine to wait on that piece to see where we're at, but I kind of think that's what we do here is go out on our own, so I'm not scared to do that.
Sean, I wonder if I might ask the staff to comment about our capacity to do more students who are who are enrolled in online learning. Are we okay with?
Sorry, I'm not sure I heard you all the way, Charlie. Capacity for what?
How are we with having the capacity to accommodate more students who are doing online learning?
Well, I think that's part of the pressure for the August 9th date, right? Because it involves how we section students into classes, how we staff those classes. That involves changing potentially staff members' assignments where they didn't think they were teaching online. That involves changing master schedules in buildings if more of those students are pulled out and they have smaller sections that aren't viable any longer. So it's already too late to do that, but we'll make it work. But that's my urgency when you hear me talk about August 9th, and we have a great new online principal, and I don't want to lose him right away. And so we'd love to see him commit to the job that he's here to do and not just build schedules as well. So I think that's just part of it is we'll make it work, but we really can't go past the 9th and have a viable program by the first day of school.
Any other topics folks want to cover?
I did have a hopefully an easy question, and maybe it's for Chase or Matt. Can you remind me, under the mask law, can we require our visitors to the school to wear masks, or we can't require anyone on a school property to have a mask?
Nobody?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else, directors, or?
Can I just
team?
clarify, Sean, to make sure we bring you back what you want? So it sounds like expanding out that part under the quarantine piece and kind of talking through what our legitimate options would be, knowing that we could get some new guidance one way or another around that, and then also just looking at what a legitimate plan for us would be, like you said, knowing that it might not relate to one of those other institutions, but knowing that, hey, we could still have our own plan and our own process around quarantines, and when would we employ that at different times and periods. I think, the point to the parents is we know that we don't have all the questions answered with making that decision for online, but I think the other thing we've learned, I'm not sure we're ever going to have all the questions answered with that component. So I hope you at least feel like we're trying to give you as much as we can and trying to share what we can do around the health and safety effort, and know that, if left to our own opinion, we'd be choosing a different path, but we're trying to be as honest and transparent as we can around what we can do and what we could plan for moving forward. So I really appreciate the conversation from you guys, and like I said, part of my job is not to be the naysayer, but to make sure we've thought through and that you guys can consider the same things that our team's talked about the last few weeks on this.
But that was my ask, so, I'm one person
Yeah,
up here.
exactly.
So I look
So is there
around
any
to my
other- yeah.
cohorts to see if that's okay. I don't want to tell you what to do.
I think it makes sense. I think, though, your notion of getting Brady's input on the whatever quarantine options you
Yes.
cut together would be really helpful.
Sure.
And have we been really clear about why we cannot do a mask option classroom approach?
Sure. So we can work through that one a little bit, Charlie, here, kind of have a conversation around that. Again, I feel like I have to keep going back to this just because I don't, I mean, it would be great, right? I mean, I think it's a great thing. I think it would be disingenuous for us to put out a survey and ask that of the community right now because we know the problems that are behind that. And so we're not going to go ask you a question where we know the challenges that would be upon us with trying to solve that problem. I really think about it from an enforceability challenge standpoint, a logistical challenge, and a space challenge for us in different ways about aligning the appropriate staff so that we didn't have 23 students being served by one teacher and 3 being served by another. That's not going to seem fair. And then we get into who's the 23, the masked or the non-masked, and how does that work? The logistical part about as well with being able to align staff to that conversation in classrooms. Do we actually have the physical space to do that? That's also a logistical concern depending on how we'd have to split those classes. Again, to the enforceability piece, are our teachers really, even if it's a mask-only classroom, are our teachers really even able to enforce that just because their parents have said they want them to do that? Are we putting our teachers in a position where it would be a difficult concern for them to say now they're asking people to keep their masks on or do some of those things because that's what their parents' request is? That's an employment or a labor concern. And so I think those are, there's a potential cost implication if we would split those classes into a certain way or have to provide additional staff because the class was either too large or too small because we weren't able to balance it. So again, I don't want to be a naysayer and, rattle off all the problems I have here for notes as we've talked about it, but we did meet as a team. As soon as we saw that, we talked to health and safety about it. We talked about, is this something we can make viable? But again, I'm not going to recommend, that we go ask this question when we can pretty well predict, even with the data we get back, we just know it's not going to be viable for us to implement that type of solution.
Well, that's a good response, Matt, thanks.
Yeah.
But I would also wonder if we were going to to contact the nearby districts that are considering that approach or.
To contact those other districts that are considering that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so on Wednesday, that wouldn't have been Wednesday, would have been, I was trying to think of the day we had the Grantwood superintendent's check-in call, Friday, I believe that was, and Clear Creek wasn't able to join. They're the ones that put out this survey to their parents, and so we weren't able to engage them in the conversation about if they're really moving forward with that. No other district in the Grantwood region was planning to do that. I don't anticipate, from the last conversation about the Urban Ed Network, the large school districts in Iowa, none of them were planning to employ any of that at that time. That could have very well changed by now, but yes, I think the easy answer is we continue to have monthly check-ins or biweekly check-ins with those superintendent and school district groups that if somebody's able to do it effectively, we'd love to hear about how they're doing it or what we could learn from them, but that's the opportunity for us in those groups is to make sure we're sharing out what our measures are, and so that hopefully nobody's getting out in front with something that works that they aren't sharing with the rest of the group because we're all in this together from that standpoint. So we'll continue to talk and check in, Charlie.
Okay, thanks.
You've kind of alluded to this a couple of times, and it made me put my parent hat on and ask a question that I think some parents may have on their minds. I see especially elementary ed as a partnership between, my kids' teachers and me, and we work together. If I'm a parent and I want my child to wear a mask and I have a conversation with my teacher, can I expect that the teacher is going to enforce those wishes? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question that some parents may be asking. I certainly would have the expectation that if I told the teacher this is the family decision, they're going to wear a mask. If you see them not wearing a mask, tell them to put it back on. The teacher would do that. But I've heard you make a couple comments that might not be logistically possible.
Yeah, I think that one's a difficult question to give a black and white answer to, Lisa, from the standpoint that, we're employers of those teachers, right? And so we have to ask them to follow the law. And if the law says they can't enforce mask requirements, even if it's the wishes of the teacher, they may have the standpoint that they don't believe in the mask thing. I'm not saying that of our staff, but if they don't believe in it and a parent asks them that, why are they obligated at that point legally? May not be the right or the ethical or the thing we would ask them to do, but I'm just saying what's the legal basis that we could compel our staff to do that? Of course we like to see it as a partnership and a communication on that aspect, and so I don't think we'd ever start the conversation there or approach it that way, But I'm just trying to go to worst-case scenario. If we drilled all the way down, would we really be able to compel them to follow through on the parents' wishes?
I mean, because the kid is 7 and I'm their mom and I'm in charge.
I know.
And I said that they wear a mask. Like, I mean, I think that's
But you're a
the
lawyer
legal
too,
basis.
and I think you also understand that point.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what I don't understand is I think if they're 18 and a senior in high school, then by all means, that 18-year-old gets to make their own decisions. They're an adult. But if it's a 7-year-old at an elementary school, heck no, she doesn't get to make her own decisions because I'm her mom. I mean, and I'm just shocked to hear that, and I think that's important information for some parents to maybe understand in deciding whether or not to go online or not, is even if they want their kid to wear a mask, our teachers might not be willing to enforce that.
Again, I would hope, that was awkward
That was
silence.
awkward
I mean, that was
silence
the end of my
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. I guess I would
just reiterate.
yeah.
We can obviously talk to Brady, but he has obviously expressed, I don't want to talk to Brady yet, but he's talked about some of the concerns about things being put on the backs of teachers in the classroom because there isn't a way for the district to mandate it.
Yeah, it's,
To try to step in for 24, 26, and in some circumstances, like 36 students in their classroom on a daily basis. And so it's obviously something that, so we can look into it from a legal standpoint and see who's trying to find that answer. But I'm with Matt, it's more of a relationship piece also with the parents, but also with our staff as well as we try to balance all of these.
I just feel like the intent behind the law in May was to give parents choice. And if I'm a parent and I want this choice, like that's what Des Moines said. And you can have a choice not to wear a mask, absolutely. And we're not going to have a teacher try to put a mask on you. That's never going to happen. But if we're making a parental choice, which is what Des Moines empowered every parent in Iowa to do with this legislation, I just have to think that we have to be able to have a system in our schools to respect that parent decision as well. And I'm not, but to me, the worst case scenario is that we have a teacher who doesn't believe that masks work and is just going to absolutely refuse to do any type of enforcement in that class. I don't think that's following the letter of the law that Des Moines passed, and I don't think that's respecting parental choice.
I think that's a scenario. I think the other scenario, when we look at it from that concern is, 13 to 14 parents want their kids masked up and wants the teacher reminding them. The 14th doesn't. They say something to the 14th kid on that day, and then we have an upset parent with that teacher. That's what the teacher's thinking through. And it sounds easy in the best case scenario where the intent's all good and there's the partnership. But if we get it wrong one time, it takes one time in our school district with over 1,000 teachers that we end up in a situation. So that's where I'm just trying to say I think we have to be careful with it, and we have to think through what the worst case scenario is, because what we're going to ask one teacher to do, we're going to ask all 1,000 plus to do, and that has to be consistent. And so when we say this is what we'd like to see happen, I think that's the slippery slope for us about now we're compelling everybody to do that, and it only takes one example of where it's implemented wrong or where one person feels like that's a violation of their rights, and then we have a scenario. So I understand. I mean, I hope Alice's 4th grade teacher tells her to pull her mask up. I hope she does, from a partnership perspective. But at the same time, when we think about our employees and what we can ask them to do, I just think that's the difficult balance.
this is tricky. So a parent doesn't want their child to wear a mask. That's their choice. That's what our governor's given us the opportunity to do. So now, in a classroom where we clearly, as a district, are encouraging students to put masks on, we're talking about quarantine policies that would not be that would be more restrictive for students who are not wearing masks. So that teacher in that situation is going to have to be a good partner to that parent, would have to tell the student to take their mask off. If a student in a classroom chose to put on a mask because of peer pressure or because of the encouragement the district is putting forward, that's a tough position to put a teacher into, I think. I think this is very tricky. I think we need to be very, very, very careful as we work our way through this.
I think a fair expectation, though, and with that relationship you have as a parent with your teacher, to say, you have that conversation, say, I want my child to be wearing their mask. Let me know if they're not, because then it falls on me to have that conversation with my child. I think that's that is a fair expectation, that I need you to let me know if they're not doing what I'm asking. It is a harder sell to say, be the parent right now for me. That's tough, but that's what teachers do on a daily basis, is they parent our children. But they're not there to do that, they're there to educate them. So it's a tough ask for a lot of that stuff, I think. All right, I'm looking around to see if anybody else has anything more to say. I know there's a pretty heavy topic, and, we will come back in a week and revisit this conversation for sure, with any new guidance or any updates that the team wants to share. So is there any last minute thoughts tonight? Chase, you look like you got something to say.
Mine's going to be more of a closing, so if you got something to add in substantive, go ahead.
I think that, maybe this has gone unsaid, but with reopening, or keeping the online enrollment period open, we do believe that we need to put guidance out to families. And so I don't want the board to be caught off guard. We are happy to continue research and to bring back information to consider, but we can't sit on the draft guidance we have for a week and not publish it. And so I just didn't want us to walk away and then all of a sudden us push something out and be like, wait, don't bring it back next week. Okay.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You said open it up and open it till the 9th.
Yep.
I have no problem with that. Looking around, everybody's agreeing with it, it looks like.
The message I would send to parents is, I personally, Lisa Williams, as one out of a 7-member board, am open to tweaking our quarantine policy to make it a little bit more stringent. Other than that, I think the draft guidance is really good. And then who knows what's going to happen on Thursday at the press conference, and we may not have any power. And so if you're an online parent trying to or if you're a parent trying to decide where to go, I would watch that press conference real closely on Thursday. And if we're not allowed to do anything, then you know what school will look like, and then you can make your decision over the weekend. But if we are given some flexibility, me as one person, I'm open to a little bit more tweaking of the policy. That's what I would tell parents.
And we can even add a line to the end of that paragraph that says, we expect the new guidance to come from the state, that we will continue to, we say that overall, but if we think it's, it's been a deep conversation this evening, and so if you need to point that in that section about quarantine, we can even kind of signal that there might still be some massaging of that language potentially.
Yeah, and I'm more than willing to look at additional measures, that enhance student safety. Whether the students are wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, so.
I was just going to say, we have a great school district, we have a great school board, we have great parents, we have great staff, we have great kids. And I'm going to always assume that our people are going to do the right thing. But I think the only way we get to more people doing the right thing and having the best plan we can is by having the conversation we had tonight. And it wasn't always easy, and it's not comfortable, it's difficult, right? But these are the things that we're struggling with. And nobody wants to be here, nobody wants to be talking about this. I'd much rather be talking to you about the strategic plan work we've done the last 2 weeks, right? And talking to you about our learning goals. But this is the reality of where we're at again. And that's how we're going to get to the best place we can be. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And it helps our team get better when we think through those concerns and all the different lenses you guys bring. So thanks, and we'll be ready to go with more information next week.
Thank you, Matt. I think that's a great way for us to end our night. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, everyone.